the latest of our HPMA Scotland webinars. I'm delighted to see everybody here today. Can I just do some introductions around about what will happen and the process for our webinar today? Firstly, can I say that we are recording the session, so please be aware that it's being recorded. It will be uploaded onto the HPMA national website. And if I can ask you all, at the moment, the first thing you to do is to shut off your microphones, because anything you do say in any background noise will come through very clearly for us. So if you can all just take the time just to do that at the moment, hopefully that will prevent any unnecessary comments. I'll introduce myself. My name is Chris Carn. I am the Vice President, the Chair of the Scottish branch of HPMA. And so welcome to everybody. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today and today's topics, which is celebrating success. An interesting topic, something that probably we don't do enough within the NHS, within the wider health and social care sector. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today around about what that means, and maybe some tips and hints in terms of how you can apply this within your daily working. Our speaker for the day is Callum Arthur. You will have hopefully seen Callum's very varied biography in terms of what he's done in the past, which is a kind of an interesting progression into the NHS. You'll see that Callum has, after graduating from Bangor University, Callum worked with the British military in terms of a range of work around about organisational culture, and was a contributor to a number of leading journals. And more recently, he's been working with the with UK Sport in terms of as a culture and development advisor to our Olympic sports programme, which is a particularly interesting area. And Callum joined the NHS as recently as May 2021, so he's relatively new into NHS culture, so it might be interesting to see what his experiences are of working in the military, working with the Olympic committees, and now working with the NHS. So without further ado, I will pass on to Callum. He'll talk for around about 45 minutes, leaving us around about 15 minutes for some questions. Please feel free to use the chat box to know any questions you want, and I'll bring in any questions from the chat box at the end of Callum's presentation, and then subsequently offer you the opportunity to engage and come online and ask any questions you want. So without any further delay, I'll introduce Callum. There might be a short gap between Callum's presentations loading. No, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, so welcome, Callum.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that introduction. Just want to double check, is the always a nervous bit about these things, is the slide showing properly there, Chris?
Yeah, I can certainly see it, Callum.
Perfect.
Hopefully everybody else can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Chris. I'm really excited and privileged to come and chat today, really, on this topic of celebrating success. As Chris mentioned there in his introduction, I'm pretty new to the healthcare environment. I've been in 10 months now, I think. And prior to that, I guess my background was academia. I worked in universities for about 14 years, and my primary sort of role there was to examine leadership. In essence, that's what my PhD was on leadership and culture, what makes great leadership and all those sorts of things, and trying to understand that world from a research perspective. That was mostly within a military environment, looking at leadership and culture within infantry recruit training. Actually started in the Royal Marines, then up to Catterick, and did a lot of work there, and then out into the sort of broader cores of the military, really. And I'll share some of those reflections and observations today. I then left academia and, as Chris said, went into UK sport. That was a very much applied role, where I'd work with our Olympic sports and really to try and help them understand or sort of create cultures or environments that optimize performance as well as well-being. I sort of started in the Olympic cycle after Rio. I don't know if anybody follows sport, but you know, as a nation, we became really quite good at winning medals since the funding started back in the 90s. I think we went from about 34th in the table to 2nd at Rio. But there were some noises after the Rio Olympics about some of the cultures in the sports might not have been optimal. So UK Sports set up a team to try and help understand how we might create those cultures where people are under quite intense pressure, but where we can really support well-being as well as having performance. Okay, so that's just a little bit about some areas that I'll try and draw on and try and relate to the sort of the health domains that we're all working in. Thank you so much for taking time out your busy schedule. Really hopeful that we'll talk about some interesting stuff, and actually I'm really keen to hear your feedback and reflections, either at the end of the session, or please do contact me afterwards and help in this area, because you know, it's such an important topic, this, about how we celebrate success, how we can praise people, how we can reward people in a way that's really optimal for them. I guess the origins of the session is when I first joined NHS Lothian, one of my great colleagues, Jenny McCusker, in her sort of real curious, thoughtful way, said, Callum, you know what, you've come from sport. I think you guys are really good at celebrating success. Would you be able to do a session on that? I'm like, yeah, sure, yeah, I could put something together, but you know, I don't really think we celebrate success very well in sport, and actually I don't think we celebrate the right things in sport, but I can certainly put something together. So it was quite an interesting sort of origin of this session, really. It's not something I've done before I joined the NHS. It wasn't part of my repertoire, let's say, of going into sports or the military, but there was real similarities across the domains, I guess. So before we sort of kick off, there's two perspectives maybe that I sort of encourage us to think about today. And really we're going to focus on the emotional domain, how we feel about stuff, our emotions, our mood, our affect, how that might impact our thoughts, or indeed how our thoughts might impact our emotions, and then how they might impact ours and other people's behaviours. So I guess it's sort of a cognitive sort of behavioural background, but that's the sort of things we're going to think about when we're talking about this stuff about celebrating success. There's one little bit we're going to try, and hopefully the technology is going to work. And this is something called Mentimeter. Now, I don't know if anybody's used this platform before, but what I'd like you to do, or if possible, is to using your iPhone or your smart device, is if you can go to www.menti.com, and I'll give you a code in a little bit, and we'll maybe try and take part in a live online quiz. Now, lots of pressure, and it may or may not work. So if I ask you to do that, if you want to, and then we can have a wee go at this quiz that we're going to sort of do in a couple of minutes' time. I don't know if it'll work on your NHS phones. It may or may not, but it work on your personal phone. So we might have a go at that. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so the session. Why celebrate success? We're going to talk a little bit about that. What's the point? You know, why should we do this? Why is it important? What benefits will we accrue from it? And those sorts of things. We're going to talk a little bit about the brain science, about what it is that maybe sits behind it, what happens in our brain when we receive rewards and praise and all those sorts of things. And then we're going to sort of take a bit more of a social, psychological view on it about, okay, so we're going to look a bit about the compassion and gratitude literatures and see what we can learn from there and how we might adopt these. Then at the end, towards the end of the session, we're going to talk a little bit about all right, so it's probably a good thing to do, in some situations. So how might we do it? And what are some of the things to watch out for? What are some of the barriers that might get in the way of us doing it? And then we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at goals and how the types of goals we set might relate to how we praise and those sorts of things. And that really brings us into the sport world and why I don't think we celebrate success in the right way in sport. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. And then a little bit of a takeaways. And then finally, hopefully, as Chris said, we'll try and leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end there. Okay, so if we could navigate to www.menti.com, and this is the code I'd like you to put in there, 87118984. Don't worry, that code's going to come up again, and we have to close out of this presentation though and reopen another one on Mentimeter. And let me just bring this in. So hopefully, Chris, can I just check? Can you see the Mentimeter slide there?
I can see one that says 3 words that describe how great leaders make you feel.
Perfect. Okay, amazing. That's worked. Fingers crossed the next bit will work. Okay, so if you're at that menti.com website, if you could put in the code 87118984 and then just start typing in your answers about, what are the 3 words that describe how great leaders make you feel, and see if this works. We should hopefully start seeing this being populated. Aha, there we go. Lovely. Appreciated, valued, motivated, driven, confident. Fantastic. Heard, yeah. Driven, respected. Super, thank you. So this looks fantastic. Inspired, admiring, competent, driven, capable, trusted. So I believe what's happening is the words that are used the most by most people will come up larger. So it's like your classic word cloud, for example. So by the looks of this, most people have said valued, which is absolutely astounding and fantastic, because that's what this session is really all about. Is, well, parts of it is, when we reward people, we praise people, they probably feel valued, feel appreciated, empowered, motivated, respected, confident. Again, absolutely fundamental to praise and celebrating people's successes is the confidence. Fantastic. Okay, there's one more. Oh, we've already started on this one. Fantastic. Okay, so this one is about what do we think your current manager praises you? Is it about right? Is it too little, or is it too much? Just as a quick fire round. And again, this is all anonymous. So great. So we've got 11 about right, 5 too little, nobody too much. MD get too much praise in their working lives. 7 to 12, that's decent, that's okay. 8 to 12, so we've had 20 responses so far. I think that's sort of normal. I think I've obviously done these sorts of quizzes across lots of different organizations and places, and it's normal in the fact that nobody has yet to put too much. And I think that's something that I'm going to focus on a little bit today, about maybe the reluctance to praise people and actually why we don't do that, and why it's not just the managers or the leaders. I think it's everybody. I think it's a bit of human nature in some respects. So, and we sort of try and ask us to challenge that question. But I'm loving the fact 12 about right. Loving that. That's pretty cool. But yeah, 8 is too little. And when we think it's free, to praise people, then we might tap into that a little bit. All right. So that was just a quick fire round there. We're going to come out of Mentimeter, just 2 quick quizzes. And then we're going to go back into the presentation. And as we talked about there, please do feel free to put some questions in the chat as we go through. Chris is going to be monitoring the chat there. Okay, so a little bit of brain science that sits behind this. So what happens? Why do we want to praise people? And just as a bit of a warning, I'm not a neuropsychologist. I'm a chartered psychologist, more of a generalist, but I'm not a neuropsychologist. And there may be people in this room that have more of a neuroscience background than myself. So we keep it really simple, and please. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think it's important to understand the very basic things that happen in our brain when we get rewarded. Okay, I'll put reward and punishment centers on the slide because there is two centers really in the brain that respond to when we get rewarded or when we get punishment in some sort of form. And actually, the principles behind those is that these centers really govern our adaptational behavior. When we're learning what things to do and what things not to do, we're really trying to work out what makes us feel good and what makes us feel bad, and avoid the bad things and go towards the good things in a very sort of simplistic way. And the reason that we try and do that is it's for a survival perspective, that we want to avoid things that are creating pain for us, and we want to go towards things that are giving us pleasure. And actually, it's a really fundamental attribution. Now, the brain that sits on top of these reward and punishment centers is often called the human brain. So, we have adapted and we can think and we can cognitively process things, but we still have that core that's sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain that responds to these sort of stimulus in the environment, working out, is it good, is it bad, is it going to harm me, is it going to reward me? And we know that these things can be trained and adapted. I don't know if anybody's sort of looked at this Pavlovian, some of the original experiments in this way with dogs about ringing a bell. You've got a stimulus and you're bringing out food at the same time. So you ring the bell, you pair a stimulus with a noise in this situation. So you've got some dogs, you ring the bell, you give them food, ring the bell, give them food, ring the bell, give them food, classic conditioning stuff. And then what therefore then happens is that food or the reward becomes paired with this other stimulus. So then the stimulus can happen. So if you then ring the bell, the dog will start to get a salivatory response in the absence of the food stimulus. So at that point, we know that the brain's paired those two things together. Something good, i.e. the food, and another noise that's totally unrelated to the food, but the brain has put those two things together. Now, the important thing is this will also happen for adversive stimuli as well. So if we pair the noise with something bad, we know that will also bring in that sort of negative pathway and will reduce that behavior. So it's really quite important and fundamental to what we do, having these reward and punishment pathways. Now, I guess the key bits in here is the more that we use them, the more that they get ingrained in us. Okay, so the dopamine pathways, they make us feel and they reinforce good behavior. Now we'll come on to this in a little bit about tips and tricks we might do to try to reinforce those things, and what we can do as individuals, and what we help encourage people to do to try and reinforce those pathways in our brain. But likewise, if we get lots of aversive punishment related stimulus in the environment, those pathways are also susceptible to change, so they'll become more hardwired and perhaps easier to operate, or more sensitive to that aversive stimuli. So it works both ways. And ultimately, the basic motivation, the basic principle of our brain is, some people call this the triad of motivations. It's designed to avoid pain, seek pleasure, and do the least effort possible to get to the right place and not expend too much energy. And from an evolutionary perspective, that makes a lot of sense. And something that we're going to pick up on a little bit later on in this area is that unfortunately, in humans, one of the real drawbacks, and something that probably helps us to understand some behaviors sometimes, is the fact that our aversive system, or the punishment related system, is more susceptible to activation than the reward system. So what we mean by that is that our brain is geared is positively offset to pick up threats in the environment than it is to go for reward in the environment. So evolutionarily speaking, that is totally obvious, right? So when we're evolving, if we see a lion or an apple, we should really run away from that lion than eat the apple. You know, it's not going to be very healthy, and as a species, we ain't going to survive if we try and eat the apple when a lion's trying to go after us. So fundamentally, that's at the basis of our survival instincts. Now, some would argue that our brains haven't really caught up with the demands of modern life. And actually that core part of our brain is still active, but you know, there's some arguments, some psychologists will talk about the fact that when their brain was developing, you know, in sort of olden days, let's say, it was a very useful function, but whatever that threat stimulus would disappear very quickly. It's either there, it'd eat you, and then it's gone, or it would no longer be there. We don't then go away worrying about that threat stimulus. Whereas in modern society, that threat stimulus, it can be longer lasting than the threat of a lying. It might be an upcoming presentation, it might be a performance review, whatever it might be. Our brains weren't really designed to do that and to deal with that. Now we have got a cognitive thing there that we can talk to ourselves and try and help us understand that it's not that bad, or cognitively rationalize with it, or do all these other wonderful strategies to try and alleviate that stress response. But that's still there, it's still evident, but we need to actively control it if we can. So I guess, you know, that's one of the really annoying things about being a person, is that we are pre-programmed to pick up threats more than we're to pick up rewards. And so therefore I think it's incumbent upon us to try and overcome that, right? And that's maybe why we get to that state where actually nobody perceives that their boss gives them too much praise. It might be that they give them less praise, or it might be we don't notice it and we only notice the negatives because our brain's been picked up there, you know, so that stuff's going on. So I guess the purpose of this sort of conversation is really to try and make sense of that, and to try and say, actually, this is something that we need to be aware of, and we know that we're positively, or we're more susceptible to threat-related information. So therefore, we need to maybe act a bit more in the positive information side of things to get that equilibrium, or to bring about those positive pathways. Okay, so, and we park the brain science bit there, but I think it does give us a little bit of a fundamental thing, that we have these two receptors in our brains. We're going to focus on the reward bit today. We're not really going to go much into the punishment bit. There's a little bit in there, but it's mostly how we activate this reward system and things we might do. Okay, so now a little bit on the sort of the sociological, social interaction perspective, sort of layered on top of the evolutionary or the neuroscience bit, I guess. A lot of this work comes from Michael West and the King's Fund and colleagues. He does brilliant work in this area. I'm sure you've come across this, you know, the collaborative, the compassionate, the collective leadership, and those sorts of things. So this is very much related to this stuff, and the compassionate leadership area is an area that we can use to help us activate those reward centers of the brain, or the praise and those sorts of bits. And actually, you know, compassion, it's a core value of the NHS. It's something that that we all try to do and aspire to live up to, I guess. And there's two bits I think that's really important to compassion. One is compassionate to ourselves. You know, let's be good to ourselves. Let's, at the very least, let's just give ourselves a break and try and be compassionate, act towards ourselves with compassion. I think that's really, really important. I think we can get caught up in lots of things, and especially, you know, something I've noticed in the care in this environment. You know, I was just talking with people yesterday, and I'm humbled on a daily basis with how much compassion people have for other people, and the care and the over and above people will go to for the betterment of the patients. And it's just humbling, and it's an immense privilege for me to come into this environment and witness those things. And humbled is the word that I'm continually, just amazing people doing amazing things. But whilst I see lots of outward compassion, I don't see so much inward compassion. And I think maybe it's because you don't see that as obvious, and maybe it is happening and I'm a bit blind to it, but whatever. I think it's something to think about, you know, this self-compassion that sometimes we talk about. I'm sure you saw the analogy of the oxygen mask. You know, we put our own oxygen mask on first and then help others. You know, it's that sort of thing about, you know, let's just be good and kind to ourselves. And actually, the more we do that, the kinder we are to others as well. You know, the relationship, there's definitely a relationship in there. The kinder we are to ourselves, that's often related to how kind we are to other people. So there's a really fundamental sort of reason for doing that. So then I'm going to move on just a little bit now to talk about gratitude. So this is really about being thankful and appreciation. And again, that we're focusing on the self right now. So what am I grateful for? What do I feel gratitude for in my life, or about what's going on, rather than a focus on what's bad about stuff. Now, as we just talked about, and this will come up again and again, our brains don't help us in this. They're deliberately trying to trick us up. Our brains are deliberately trying to get us to focus on the bad stuff. That's just what it's designed to do. So we need to try and trip that up a little bit, and to try and override that if we can. It's difficult, especially when we're under pressure, especially when we're not our best. You know, we've been working really hard, we're lack of sleep, other things going on, trying to juggle, you know, children drop-offs, pickups, sick kids, you know, all that family stuff with all our work stuff and all those sorts of things. You know, I'll just share an example right there. Just half an hour before this conversation, before this talk, I get a phone call from the nursery. I see it come up on my phone. My wife's away, working through in Glasgow, and I'm like, oh my days, this is a disaster, because normally one of your kids is sick, come and pick them up. I'm doing a talk in half an hour. Oh my days, what's going to go on? And actually, luckily, as I picked up the phone, I'm like, oh no, what's happened? And actually, it was a lovely nursery lady, Miss Susan. She was like, listen, Hazel's had a little accident. She's had a pee-pee in her pants, but we haven't got any more trousers. Can you possibly bring some more down? So I was like, whew. But that was the thing. I saw that number on my phone and immediately thought, oh no, what's happening? Because normally when nursery phone during the day and the kids are there, it's because there's a negative event happening. Anyway, just thought I'd share that a little bit before this. So luckily I could just quickly nip down and drop the pants off there. Okay, so gratitude. Why would we want to do this, and what's the evidence? So we can measure how much gratitude people have towards themselves. And we know that people who are typically more grateful than look for gaps will have improved overall well-being. You know, there's a very strong relationship there. We know they'll increased happiness. They'll have reduced anxiety and depression. They'll have strengthened resilience. They'll be more resilient to things. They live longer, have better quality of sleep. So these are sort of what we describe as correlational research stuff. So you measure how much gratitude people have towards themselves, and then you measure some other things, and you make correlational things. So that's quite interesting. It's not to say that we've got a causal relationship there. It's just these things seem to co-occur in people. People are more gratitude typically are in those sorts of areas. And also there's more pro-social behaviors and grateful thoughts, you know, and things can be related to those sorts of bits. So the next question is, we think there's probably a link there. Now, can we become more grateful? Is it possible to enhance our gratefulness, if that's a word? Well, it is a word, but I probably used it in not quite the right context. So there's been interventions that are purposely to explore this, and actually I'll talk about some of the bits in the next slide about what these interventions consisted of. But it turns out we can train ourselves to become more grateful, you know, and we have consequences such as higher self-esteem. We're actually more likely to help others. This is what I talked about earlier about compassion. We're more likely to help others if we've gone through this sort of training. We engage in more pro-social behavior. And there's actually some neuroscience that look at the brain actually gets rewired. I mean, there's no wires in our brain. I think we know that. But what I mean is the pathways between the different sectors become more ingrained. So we produce more dopamine in those areas, which is the happiness hormone, and helps us to be in that sort of have that enhanced well-being. I guess so. What is it? What is it that these sorts of studies did? You know, these intervention studies. This is just a real synopsis of it. So, you know, we celebrate the minor wins more. We can do something called a gratitude journal. You might have come across this. You might do them yourselves. It can be really, really important. You know, just before bed, noting down what you're grateful for today. You know, what good things have happened today, and just writing those things down. These things can make a huge difference. And again, that's just practice being more grateful. We know our brains are there to trip us up. We're focusing on what's bad rather than what's good. There's a very good reason evolutionarily for that. In modern society, it's questionable whether that's good for us or not. So we try and override that a little bit. Just the act of telling people more often what you appreciate about them gives us a good feeling and them a good feeling. And I think, you know, we're all in the same sort of trade. So I think you all sort of get this and intuitively know this. And there's probably not a huge amount new that we're talking about, but it's just sort of encapsulated in maybe a slightly different way. Thinking about what we've achieved, you know. So one of the bits in the military, the research. So we originally started doing a lot of work with military recruits. So really intense training course. Civilians come in, they join the army, the infantry, and they do their phase 1, phase 2 training, and that's anything from 26 weeks to 32 weeks, depending on if they're parachute or if they're parachute regiments, or if they're line, or if they're in the Royal Marines. Obviously, the Royal Marines train at a different place down south. So in that bit there, and what can happen is, you know, you get a dropout of people from the program. And actually, halfway through the program, if we get recruits and even the section corporals, their leaders, to try and remember what they were like when they started this training, to how much they've gained in 12 weeks, let's say, and how much they've, okay, they might be struggling at this particular point in training with a particular drill, but actually, if we don't focus on that, and we focus on actually what they've gained, what they've, you know, the change that they've had, such a powerful intervention. It's a simple thing, but it's so powerful. And then, because normally if we're trying a new skill, or we're trying something new and we're failing at it, we're not achieving what we're trying to do, it hits our confidence, and then that has the other ramifications in terms of avoidance and not doing it, and doesn't really help us, because we know the more confident we are, the better we are at performing things. So one of the issues we can have is when people are hit this confidence barrier or trying this other thing, and they're not making as much progress as they would like to make, you get into this negative spiral. But a way to break that is, okay, let's think about how much, you know, what have we achieved to this point? What are the good things that we've done? Really, really powerful, but yeah, really simple. Volunteer to help someone, you know, just that, again, that act of being compassionate, giving compassion to others makes us feel good about ourselves and tends to help us to feel more grateful. So just taking time to make that phone call, or just to help out, you know, to like I'm in Western General Hospital in Edinburgh tomorrow. They're having a clothes drop off. There's an email's come out, so I'm going to try tonight and find some clothes to drop them off because they're short of things. So and I know that I'll be helping, but it'll make me feel good, because, you know, let's not lie about it. You know, we need to do things to make us feel good as well as doing good for other people. There's a double hit there, so why not do that? And lastly, a little bit here is our brains like novelty. Okay, so doing the same thing over and over again probably is not going to work. So in this space here, when we get to the point where what we're doing is losing its power or losing its impact in terms of helping us to feel a bit better, we probably need to shift it up a little bit and just mod it, not throw it away, you know, not stop doing it, or it's not working anymore, but we just need to find something a little bit different to do. And then we might go back to something else. And I think there's something in here about goals and setting goals. And when we get to this point, then we no longer feel the rewards of what we're doing. Actually, that behavior maybe stops, but it might just need a little bit of a tweak. Anyway, so where are we at time-wise? Okay, we're doing all right. We're doing all right. All right, so hopefully we've made the case, and I think I probably didn't really need to make the case so much with this audience about the importance of celebrating success, importance of gratitude, and those sorts of things. And it has had a self-focus, because, you know, I think if we look after ourselves, if we're more grateful, evidence is that'll emanate out from us to other people. And one of my PhD students, who was just finishing off before I left academia, her research, her PhD was in the contagion of emotion from a leadership perspective. So how emotions are contagious in a room. And we do all sorts of fun things with people, both positive and negative, and some moderators of those relationships. But there is really strong evidence that the emotions, they're contagious. They spread in rooms and environments and in people, and both good and bad ones. So anyway, so now we're going to think a little bit about to others. And when we create environments where we maybe praise our others, or we try and emanate those out from us. So one of the practicalities, complexities, and barriers. So what might stop us from doing this? Why is it the fact that, you know, I spent 12 years of my life researching leadership, speaking with people who have been led by great leaders and average and not so good leaders, and working out what are the differences. That was a great job, but the most common thing that nobody ever reported back was the problem with my leader is they just praised me too much. And I was just so curious, because it's such an easy thing to do, maybe on the surface, but I don't think it is that easy when we unpick it. All right, so motivation. So one of the barriers to this is this thing about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So I'm not going to deliberate over that. I think we probably have a good sense of what these things are. Extrinsic motivation is when behavior is controlled by external. I'm doing this for money, I'm doing it for reward, I'm doing it to avoid the scorn of my boss, I'm doing it to avoid an embarrassing situation. Extrinsic. Intrinsic is I'm doing it for the pleasure of the activity, separate to the rewards that might be happening. There's a sort of continuum there. It is a bit more complex than that. There's about 7 differentiations between intrinsic to extrinsic, but we're not going to go there just now. But I'm just going to share a little story with you, if I may. So this is around, you know, there was these kids that used to play football in a little village, and they used to play this game called Shapes or Wally. Now this game is about you kick football against the wall, and the next person kicks it, and the next person kicks it, and if you miss the wall, then you're out, and so forth. So it's called all. I've done this sort of thing all over the country, so it's called all different things, and some people call it Kirby, some people call it different things. So anyway, it's that notion of it. Anyway, this village, there was this amazing wall in the village. Now the problem is that there was an elderly gentleman used to live in this house, and it was a gable end of his house. Now, I don't know if anybody's noticed, you get these old houses that have had the windows blocked up, right? And I believe that was because in some point in our history, how much tax you paid on a house was related to how many windows you had in your house. Anyway, this was one of those houses. So all the windows on the gable end had been bricked up. And so it was a perfect wall for playing football against. So these kids would come on a Sunday morning and play football there. Unfortunately, this elderly gentleman, the walls were quite thin, and he would like nothing better than a Sunday morning to sit down, read his newspaper. But then, bang, this kids playing outside. He was quite a clever old man, this guy. So he goes out and he's like, okay. Listen, kids, I love the fact that you guys are playing here. I really, really love it. And actually, I love it that much. Here's £1 each for y'all. And the kids are like, this is brilliant. Thank you so much. And they've got £1. They go in and they get a can of juice and a sweetie in the shop. And they come back and they play even harder. And they're playing brilliant. And then they come back the next week. Same thing happens. Come back the following week. And the old man was like, well, I'm really sorry. I've only got 50p this week. My pension's not come through, and I've only got 50 pence. So here's 50p for you. And the kids went, okay, 50p. It's better than nothing, I guess. So they go and they get a can of juice or a sweetie. So still better than nothing. And that goes on for a couple of weeks. And then they come back one Sunday, and the old man was sat there, and he was like, he comes out. The kids are there playing the football. And he said, listen, kids, I'm really sorry. I love the fact you're playing here, but I don't have any money to give you. My pension's not come through, and I've got no money. And the kids are like, well, to heck with this. We're going to go and find someone else to play, So they immediately, they went off. So he was quite an astute old guy. So what he'd actually done, and this is one of the barriers, I think, to praise in this sort of thing and rewards, that maybe people are a little bit frightened of activating, is a sense that he turned what was an intrinsic motive, love playing football there, replaced that intrinsic motive with an external reward, the money, and then removed that external reward. So they replaced what it meant for the children to play there, replaced the external reward, and then removed it, and then the behavior distinguished, the behavior disappeared. So, and it's very sort of clever ways. So I think that there might be something in that space, because we have to be really careful when we're in this space about dependencies on reward, dependencies on those extrinsic motivational things. Now, the one caveat in there is that that it depends what that reward signifies. So in that place, the reward signified that it became about controlling their behavior. Whereas you could have done it in such a way where the reward signified competence rather than control. Really subtle difference. But there's a lot of research that shows a difference between the same reward, the same monetary value, but the conditions in which it's given and the rationale behind why this reward is given. One side it's controlling, to control the behavior. The other side it's an indication that you're doing really well, and it's about competence. And they have very differing effects, as I'm sure you can imagine. Okay, so I just wanted to share that. One of the complexities or nuances around this stuff. Really quickly, this is about, so in studying research for a number of years, I had to do a load of reading around the background of things. And in the 80s, sort of 90s, it was all about reward and punishment, bonuses, sort of ER processes, those sorts of things. And the better the bonus structures you have in place, the more you get out of your employees and those sorts of things. That sort of reward punishment or the sort of controlled leadership thing was replaced a little bit in sort of late 90s, early 2000s with more of a transformational or charismatic sort of leadership approach, which really built upon the foundation of the reward and punishment, the transactional relationship per se, and wanted to build on that by inspiring people, by creating a sense of belonging, identity, and ownership, And these were often called the charismatic, the new leadership theories back then, or the transformational leadership. And actually, that's what my PhD was in, the transformational leadership paradigm. I did look at lots of other paradigms, and that was just one of them. Now, these are sort of going out of fashion, out of flavor a little bit, and being replaced by the more sort of collective, compassionate leadership, like Sir Michael West sort of speak to. So things move, thankfully. You know, knowledge progresses and move on. But nonetheless, the fundamental bit of transactional leadership is still really important. And there's a lot of research in there. So the two bits in here, so the top study on the right-hand side there, that was a review of and providing guidelines around how we might reward and how we might punish different behaviours. Now, punishment is a word that we have to use very carefully and what we mean by that. But it's the ER process. Is if there's undesirable behaviours, somebody's not acting in a way that's in line with NHS values, for example, how do we then, what process, what management procedures are in place to try and correct that and such. But I guess, you know, 65% felt as though they received no praise. Leaders felt that they praised enough. Now, this is a phenomenal thing and something that came out. So when I speak to the leaders, they felt as though, let's say, how often do you praise your subordinates, your team, your followers? Again, that word's a bit of a funny word, but you know, and they always felt as though they praised the people that they led more than the people that they led thought they received praise. So there's always a discrepancy there, and it's always the leader thinks to do more than the person receives. Now, that might be because of the fact that our brains are more prone to pick up negative than it is praise, so we might just feel that, or it might be that they genuinely do less. We don't really know, to be honest, but it's very difficult to sort of untangle that question in there. But I guess one of the bits is a fundamental thing. So this is two of the research studies that was part of my PhD that subsequently got published. I was looking at this transformational, being charismatic, you know, the vision, all those sorts of, the sense of identity sort of things. But in both these studies, the one behavior that came about, the biggest predictor of attitudinal variables like self-confidence or mental well-being like self-esteem, and then ultimately performance, was how often the individuals felt they were praised. Just this contingent reward is what we called this behavior. And it was just phenomenal. And it was the lowest behavior, but it yet had the biggest impact on the key outcomes that we're looking at. So, you know, and I was thinking it wasn't going to be those things because this was a dated theory. This was stuff that we spoke about in the 80s and 90s, and it was this new stuff. Anyway, it wasn't the case. It was really quite simple. And I guess, but there's some guidelines behind this. Okay, so praise, it has to be contingent, you know, it has to be contingent on and linked to specific actions, has sort of specify the reasons, you know, why we're being praised, what's important about it, personalized, so it's to the individual, it's not a generic praising statement, timely, it needs to be pretty close to the event. And the magnitude matching. So this is it. It's not like a huge amount of praise for a little thing, or a tiny bit of praise for a massive thing. We try and magnitude match, which is really important. We try and do about right. And then consistency. You know, this thing around that if we're doing it, we need to sort of be consistent in how we're applying it across different people within the organization. Okay. Lastly, so from sport, marginal gains, the goals, the processes, those sorts of things. This is, you'll be pleased, this is the last one, and we're going to have a wee chat in a second. So the basic principle of this, I'm sure we're all familiar with the notions of goal setting, Locke and Latham's work around, you know, setting sort of different types of goals, short-term, long-term, and how they, you know, smarter goals, those sorts of things. This is related to smarter goals, but it's about the types of goals that we might set and the types of goals we might celebrate. So if we just ignore the marginal gains bit just now, and we think about this sort of goal hierarchy there, we have the process, performance, outcome, and vision. Okay, so vision is our dream goal, right? Where do we want to be in 5 years' time? What do we want everybody in the organization to feel? Or it might be, I want everybody to think that that I care for them as a leader. It might be, you know, something in those sorts of bits. And then the outcome goal might be something that's around about what other people think. Okay, so it's something about other people. So it's not within our entire or how other people perform. So in a sporting example, the outcome goal is quite straightforward. It's winning the Olympics. It's becoming top 5 in the league. Our likelihood of achieving this goal is at least partially dependent upon other people. Because of course I could perform optimally, but I might never win an Olympic medal because my optimum might not quite be fast enough, or somebody else might just play a bit better on that day. You know, so that going for a job interview is one of those things. Being on an interview, you know, trying to go for a job, and there's other people. The outcome of that's going to be at least partially dependent upon who else is in that, who's in the competition with you. So that's your outcome goal, nailing that job. The performance goal, however, is not dependent upon anybody else. That's entirely dependent upon you and how your skills and how good you are and how much you prepare. So we'd always in sport and we'd always try and set performance-related goals because they're in our control. The outcome goals really aren't, you know, they partially are, but they're really not in our control. And then the process goals are what goes into those performance goals. So it might be that just showing up is something that we want to do. Yeah, just you know, if it's about, you know, getting fitter, it might just be about putting my trainers on and walking around the block. That's the process goal. The performance goal might be, I'll do it in under 20 seconds or whatever it might be, right? So you put that in there. The brilliant things about process goals is it doesn't matter how well it's done. Just the fact that you've done it's a good thing and should be celebrated. It really should be celebrated, and often isn't. And this is the thing about, you know, when I started this conversation about in sport, we don't celebrate the right things. It's all about the outcome. It's all about winning. It's all about those sorts of things. Now there is examples of brilliant things that happen in sport that don't necessarily do that. So that's the point. And the marginal gains, I'm not going to get into that, but that's the really small minutiae, the real detailed stuff. Once we've got all these other bits in place, what's the really little things that can help us in those situations? Okay, so as a summary from the goals, it's these process goals that I really want us to focus in on, and how can we emphasize that. The very fact that you've turned up on a team session and listening today, okay, we might be doing other things at the same time, but just the fact that we're here is a good thing. You know, the performance might be, well, how much have we remembered? How much do we pay attention? That's important, of course it is. The outcome goal might be, you know, do we nail that job? Do we deliver a good presentation? Whatever that might be. Okay. And again, you know, when we bring this down to what are you going to do today to move you closer to your dream goal? So this is an axiom around about the process goals and how we can break down these, you know, so it might be an Olympic medal and how we break that down into how many seconds every day we need to improve in order to make that time type thing. Okay, so checklist, aid memoir. You know what? The problem with my boss is they just don't praise and thank me too much. Never heard that before. Still yet to hear it. So I'd be interested if anybody has that here. Has to be sincere and contingent. So that's the key, and that's the difficult bit to that. Goals, the small wins. Let's think about process, performance, and outcome goals, and celebrating them all, not just outcomes. The high expectations trap. Well, it's just your job. You should be doing that anyway. Compassion, civility, gratitude. Even when you don't feel like it, it can make us feel better. Okay. A little bit over time. We've still got about 7-8 minutes to do some conversations if we want. So I'd love to hear any questions, observations.
Thanks, Callum. That was really interesting. I'll open up to questions in a minute if anybody has them. Just wondered on the back of some of the things you were talking about, whether or not, I mean, you've got quite a varied background, quite actually different organisations at work. I mean, very different. So if you come from the kind of military background and then going into sport and then come into the NHS, what your observations were around about how praise is articulated in these different settings, because, my thought is that maybe you've given examples there in terms of improving performance, particularly around the sporting aspect of it. The army doesn't necessarily sound like an area that's going to be heaped with praise, but it's hugely important. It might be hugely important in terms of what theirs are. I wonder whether or not you thought that, do we teach managers, do we teach leaders in our organisation to praise enough? I had an example of somebody who was talking to me a couple of weeks ago, and they were describing a scenario where they were pulled into a room and very heavily praised, and it was very almost like disconcerting to them. And they wondered what it was all about, and only to find that about 10 days later, a staff satisfaction survey came round, and one of the questions on it was, does your manager praise you? So clearly what it was the manager had got wind of this and had made sure that they go. So it was back to that, but it has to be genuine. It has to be. So it's almost acts as a demotivator, and I wonder whether or not your observations as to whether in the NHS were good enough at actually teaching people how to praise in the context of what you've seen before.
That's great question, Chris. And I think, as always, in any environment, we'll see people doing amazing things, and we'll see some things that could maybe be a bit better. And I think generalizing across context is always a little bit dangerous, I think, in some ways, and in some respects, because there's always examples of good and bad in any organization that we ever look at, and that's including high performance sport. To be an Olympic athlete, some sports, their tradition was lots of praise. Some sports didn't have that tradition, but they still produced really, really good athletes. They might not have been as happy or in those bits, but they're still winning medals. So this is what I mean by the outcome is not a good indicator of success in a lot of ways, and we can get distracted by that. I think your point about teaching people how to praise, I think, is so important. It's like, the amount of runners I meet who are injured because we never get taught to run. We just assume that we can run properly, but the actual style and the run is horrific, and that's why we get injured all the time. And I think it's those things. It's a really difficult thing to do, but it's something more overlooked. But I think the flip side of that is how do we deal with the bad behaviours as well. I think those two things need to be treated together. I think in isolation you lose, because both those brain parts we know work together. So I think that conversation probably needs to happen along these management processes as well as praise. But to sum up, I've saw amazing things in the NHS. I've obviously heard some pretty bad stories about, no idea. I don't know how well I'm doing. I've never had praise before, but I've heard that across the board. I don't think it's unique. I don't know if I answered your question. I sort of sat on the fence a little bit there, I think, but
that's fine. So there's a question somebody sent me who's had to drop off to another meeting, and I think it comes from the highlight: is there a difference between external praise and internal praise? So praise from outside. So we often look at it, the NHS gets a lot of external praise, particularly during COVID and the pandemic. Everybody's doing such a great job. So you hear that externally, but not necessarily reflected internally in your job. Is there any evidence around about that? Or have you come across any thinking in that area?
Such a fascinating area, isn't it? And it's the curse of being in the public eye, and it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? That 1 minute you're the hero, next minute you're cut down. And I think the British society is classic for chopping down tall poppies, right? They build people up just to bring them down. So I think there's a real challenge there, and a real vulnerability from people who work in the public sector, in the military and in sport, but in the NHS even more so. I think about that notion that you're at the behest of public opinion, and that's influenced probably by the press and all those sorts of other things, and we don't always have a lot of control over that. So I think it's a real issue, and I think it can be really has to be managed really carefully internally. I don't have any solutions. I don't know what to do about that. It's just another nature of the environment that's additional challenge that comes to bear on us all, I think, because it feels great when we're getting it, but you know.
There's a question come in, sort of Mariana Chambers. I don't know if Mariana's still on.
I am, yes, Chris.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I do. It's Marina Chambers, and I'm a bit of a blow in. I'm coming from Northern Ireland. I'm not actually in your Scottish HPMA, but I'm joining you anyway from sunny Portrush. Can I just ask you something? I found it very interesting when you talked about the kids coming to play football, something that they love to do, and then they got paid a reward for doing something that they love to do. And then when it was taken away, the reward, all of a sudden what they love to do, they didn't want to share that anymore. I find ourselves maybe in a position with COVID. We have had a really tough ask. Lovely to be praised from the outside looking in. Equally, to try and get shifts filled, I've had to put in and build in a reward scenario, which now that we're coming out the other end, will have to cease. There is no funding, no money for that. And I envisage just what you have said there. How are we going to fill, or hard to fill, shifts if we no longer have that, you know, monetary ability? And how do we bring in the praise that they feel that, you know, they're bringing so much to the party? And I'm talking predominantly about our frontline workers.
Yeah. Wow, that's a great. Is it Mariana? Is it that's a great?
It's worse than that. It's Marina.
Marina. Okay, there you go. There you go. That's such, yeah, it's such a difficult thing, isn't it? Because you know, and then it's the removal of reward, we know, has a different effect than a punishment, or than the giving of it. So we know that taking something away from people that they already have is worse than giving them it in the first place. So we're in a really difficult position there. There's a lot, you know, the cognitive biases, the sort of thinking fast, thinking slow stuff in terms from cognitive psychology talk a lot into, you know, the differences in the removal of something and the gaining of something. And again, they talk about our brains being positively offset to pick up on losing something as opposed to gaining something. So it typically flags a bit higher in us. But, and you know what, I on the hop, just beyond explaining really carefully and being as open and honest and transparent as people as possible as to why the situation is the way it is. And I think just because we've told people once doesn't mean they've heard it. And I think it's just that repeated sort of and empathy and all those sorts of things. I don't know, have you got any ideas yourself in that? Because
we recognise that, you know, it was time limited, it was extended, because pandemic doesn't run by financial years. It determines when it feels it's going to come out of it again. And we certainly know we're at that stage now with the trade unions and having that conversation, but it's still about making sure that the staff feel appreciated, reward, and maybe that is it. It's about the communication that goes out, why it's ceasing, and indeed if we have to put something in place at risk, albeit not a COVID rapid response payment for shifts, that it ends up being a critical shift payment or something different. I'm just scared how we move ourselves back out of that without getting the bad PR associated with it, and that staff are feeling undervalued rather than the whole purpose of it was to make them appreciate or feel appreciated. So it probably, when you start something like this, yeah, you should be thinking about how am I going to bring myself back out again.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because you're in a really difficult situation at the start and you need to get something in place. But yeah, then the unintended consequences is maybe where we're at just now, about how we now withdraw that, and because we just can no longer doing it if that's the case. And yeah, other than really explaining and taking lots of time to explain why and the rationales behind things.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid tip. And the good news is that it's across all of Northern Ireland. It's not just specific to the trust I work in. So we'll work on it together.
Okay, great. Really
thanks. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Callum. I'm just conscious that we're probably just over our time and people are going to have to get away for different meetings. So can I just thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. It's been very interesting. And we appreciate your time. It's been very interesting. Callum's slides will go up on the HPMA national website. So if you're looking for those, then you can get them. So thanks very much, Callum. If you've done one thing here that's actually astonishing, you've made me feel better about the Scottish national football team, because I was looking at your practical tips and celebrating minor wins, and I reflected for the last kind of 9 months I've been kind of fairly depressed about Scottish football, and despite the fact that they qualified, that you know, and it stems from the England football match, where after a 0-0 draw with England, you know, the cameras panned to the English football team and they were all looking crestfallen. And in the background, you could see the Scotland team taking a lap of honour for a 0-0 draw. And I've always thought that was slightly kind of pathetic, you know, slightly embarrassing. But your practical tips, I just realised now they were celebrating a minor win. So maybe feel better about that. Thank you very much.
Let's not get into Scottish football, you know.
Let's not. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. For those of you that are left on the call, then look out for the next webinar session, which should be in about a month's time, and will be beginning to be publicised now. So thank you very much, and thanks everybody for their time. I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.